The morning sun shone on the old stones of the Tower of London as people started to come through the gates. The early spring air was chilly, making visitors wrap up warm as they waited to go into the famous fortress. Among them was John Miller, dressed smartly like a successful businessman, used to people listening to him. "Is this really what people travel so far to see?" John's voice was loud enough for his 15-year-old daughter, Sarah, to shrink into a coat. "It's just some old stones. Back home, we'd have knocked this down and built something useful." His wife, Mary, quietly looked at their guidebook, pretending not to notice the annoyed looks from nearby British tourists. "Actually, dear, the tower is nearly 1,000 years old, it says here. 1,000 years of gathering dust," John interrupted, sounding like someone used to making big money decisions. "You know what we've built in the last 100 years while they were cleaning these stones? Silicon Valley, spaceships, the internet." He pointed at the old walls. "But sure, let's all pretend this museum is still important." A group of Canadian tourists walked past, their guides talking quietly and respectfully about the crown jewels. John's voice rose above the guide's talk. "Sarah, look at this. They're still showing off the crown jewels like it means something today, symbols of an empire they couldn't even keep." "Dad, please," Sarah muttered, her face red. She'd been looking forward to this trip for months, really interested in British history. Now her dad was turning it into another talk about how great America was. More tourists were starting to gather for the morning tours. 2 elderly British veterans, their jackets showing service medals, walked past the White Tower. John saw their medals and scoffed. "See that, Sarah? They're still dressing up, just like their guards. The whole country's stuck in the past." Mary touched his arm gently. "John, maybe we should join one of the official tours? The yeoman warders are actually serving soldiers." "You mean the guys in the fancy dress?" John said, using the same tone he used for dismissing bad business ideas. "This whole place is like a museum that forgot to change. Back home, we're making real history, not just keeping it." As they moved further into the courtyard, John's comments continued to get attention. Some tourists just walked faster to get away from his voice. Others, especially a well-dressed woman who said she was from Manchester, seemed to agree with him, nodding along. Then, John's attention focused on the Royal Guard as their family went around the corner of the White Tower. The guard stood perfectly still, his special rifle held just right, eyes looking straight ahead. The morning light shone on the brass buttons of his perfect uniform, each piece showing centuries of tradition. "Would you look at that?" John said, loud enough for nearby tourists to turn. "They've got this bloke standing here like a statue. In America, our soldiers are doing real army work, not playing dress-up for tourists." Sarah tried pulling his sleeve. "Dad, they are real soldiers. I read that." "Come on, love," John interrupted, moving closer to the guard. "This is what happens when a country can't move on. They turn their army into a tourist thing." He stood next to the guard, keeping what he thought was a safe distance, while talking sideways towards him. "Must be pretty boring, eh? Standing here all day while the rest of the world moves on." A woman in her 50s wearing a Union Jack badge came closer, nodding strongly. "You're right," she shouted. "My name's Susan, and I was just saying the same thing to my husband. All this show, what's it really for?" Mary noticed a group of British people gathering nearby, including the 2 elderly veterans they'd seen earlier. Their faces were stern, but they stayed quiet. She touched her husband's arm again. "John, maybe we should move along." No, this is interesting," John insisted, getting more into his subject as Susan moved closer to show her support. "See, Sarah? This is what happens when you lose a war. You end up stuck in the past, playing pretend soldier instead of being a real-world power." A murmur of disapproval went through the growing crowd. One of the veterans straightened his already perfect posture, his medals shining on his chest. But John, encouraged by Susan's keen nodding, continued his unplanned talk. I mean, think about it. While they're standing here guarding what? Some old rocks. American troops are out there leading the free world. When was the last time Britain did anything important on the world stage? He pointed rudely at the guard's special rifle. That thing probably isn't even loaded. Probably isn't even real. Sir. A quiet but firm voice came from nearby. One of the elderly veterans had stepped forward, his posture still very military despite his age. You might want to think again. Oh, we've got another one. John laughed, turning to Susan. See? They've got the old-timers doing it too. The whole country is living in a museum. The guard stayed still, but there was something in his posture, a small change in the air around him, that suggested a storm was coming. The crowd had grown bigger now, with tourists from different countries watching. Many looked upset, while others seemed to be waiting for something they felt was about to happen. Mary tried one last time. John, you don't understand. These guards are serving soldiers. Serving what? Taking pictures for tourists? John scoffed, his voice getting louder. Let me tell you something about real army power. If it wasn't for America helping out in World War II, John continued, his voice echoing off the old stones, this whole place would be speaking German right now. That's real military history, not this fancy dress show. The elderly veteran's face tightened, his medals catching the morning light. Behind him, his friend put a calming hand on his shoulder. The growing crowd had become very quiet, only broken by John's increasingly sure comments. You know what really annoys me? John turned to address the people watching. We came in and saved Europe, rebuilt everything with the Marshall Plan, became the world's greatest superpower, and they're still holding on to this old-fashioned show like it means something. Susan moved closer, nodding eagerly. My granddad fought in World War II, she announced proudly, and he used to say the same thing. The British Empire was finished after that war. America had to take over everything. The two veterans looked at each other, years of army discipline clear in their controlled reactions. The older one touched his medals without thinking, medals that, if John had looked closely, showed service in battles where British and American forces had fought together. Dad? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now. In history class, we learned that Britain fought the Nazis for years before we had to come rescue them. Exactly. John jumped on his daughter's comment, completely missing her real point. See? Even our kids know the real story. We're the ones who— Excuse me, sir? A quiet voice interrupted. A young woman in normal clothes stepped forward from the crowd. The way she stood and held herself showed she was military, even without a uniform. I'm Technical Sergeant Williams, United States Air Force. Perhaps we should— See? John pointed happily at the guard. Even our serving soldiers dress like normal people when they're not on duty. They're not stuck in the 18th century. The guard stayed still, but there was a tiny change in the atmosphere. Those closest to him might have noticed his knuckles going white on his special rifle, though his face stayed calm. The thing about empires, John continued, getting more into his topic, is that they all fall eventually. Rome fell, Britain fell, but America— He pointed at the tower walls. We're still rising. While you lot are guarding old stones, we're planning trips to Mars. That's the difference between living in the past and building the future. The Canadian family who had been nearby earlier started to move away, the parents looking sorry towards the British veterans. A group of Australian tourists watched, clearly uncomfortable, while several British people had stopped to stare in disbelief. And another thing about World War II. John raised his voice even louder, encouraged by Susan's strong nodding. We didn't just save Britain, we had to save their whole empire. Then they lost it anyway because they couldn't. Young man, the elderly veteran finally spoke up again, his voice carrying the weight of years of service. You might want to think about— Think about what? John turned, his face red with the force of his own words. "Think about that while we were building the modern world, you lot were busy losing colonies and playing dress-up with your remaining soldiers. I mean, look at this guy." He pointed towards the guard. "In America, we have our army focused on real defense, not tourist things. When's the last time a British soldier did anything besides stand still and look pretty?" The crowd had grown bigger now, and the atmosphere was full of tension. Mary had given up trying to stop him, standing back with one arm around Sarah's shoulders. The morning sun had climbed higher, making stark shadows across the courtyard as John continued his unplanned talk. His voice had taken on the same sure tone he used in business meetings, each word delivered with the belief of someone not used to being challenged. "Let me explain something about being efficient in the army," he announced, talking to the growing crowd as if they were people at a business meeting. "In the business world, we call this kind of operation out-of-date stuff. You've got highly trained people guarding what, exactly? Old stones and fancy jewelry?" The elderly veteran stepped forward again, his medals shining in the sunlight. "Young man, I served alongside American forces in—" "Exactly my point," John cut him off with a wave. "You're all living off past greatness. Britain was a great power, sure, but today you're a tourist attraction, a theme park for people who can't move on." He turned to the guard, his voice becoming kinder. "No offense to you personally, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. In America, our army bases look like something from the future. Meanwhile, you're still dressed like it's 1750. The woman from Manchester nodded strongly. "I work in defense," she added, "and he's absolutely right. We spend billions on making things modern, while they're cleaning brass buttons and changing the guard." Mary's hand tightened on Sarah's shoulder as she noticed several tour groups stopping to watch. The yeoman warders leading them had gone quiet, his usual historical talk forgotten as the scene happened. "You want to know the real difference?" John continued, getting more into his topic like he was giving a big speech. "When America shows power, we do it with big ships and secret technology. When Britain tries to show power, they bring out carriages and crown jewels." He pointed at the guard's special rifle. "I mean, look at this setup. In the time it takes you to do one changing of the guard ceremony, our quick forces could be halfway across the world." The tension in the courtyard was very strong. The Australian tourists had stopped pretending not to listen, and a group of visitors from other countries watched with expressions ranging from embarrassment to disbelief. Technical Sergeant Williams had moved closer to the veterans, her posture showing she strongly disagreed. "Dad," Sarah tried one last time, "in history class, we learned about NATO and how Britain and America are actually—" "NATO?" John laughed, the same laugh he used when junior managers made silly suggestions. "Love, NATO is just a fancy way of saying America handles everyone's defense while they spend their money on maintaining—" He waved his hand at the tower walls. "All this. You know what the British Army budget would buy in Silicon Valley? Maybe one good startup company." The guard stayed still, but there was something in his posture now, a small tension clear to those who knew what to look for. The elderly veteran had straightened to his full height, his own military posture returning despite his age. "And here's what really annoys me," John said, his voice rising with total certainty. "We saved this country in World War II, rebuilt Europe with our own money, and what thanks do we get? They stand here pretending they're still a world power, acting like their special guards are somehow the same as real military force. I've got more security at my office building." The guard's special rifle snapped to attention with a crack that echoed off the old stones, making several tourists jump. In one smooth movement, he turned his head to face John directly, his military posture changing from ceremonial to commanding in an instant. The morning air seemed to crackle with sudden tension. "Since you're so keen on talking about military history," the guard's voice carried the steel of real battle experience, his eyes fixed on John's with strong intensity. "Allow me to tell you about the reality of British military power." The crowd went completely silent. Even the woman from Manchester took a step back, surprised. The guard's change from ceremonial statue to commanding presence catching everyone off guard. Mary pulled Sarah closer, watching as her husband, for the first time that morning, seemed lost for words. There was nothing ceremonial about the guard now. His posture spoke of modern military authority, battle experience clear in every line of his posture. This wasn't a man playing at being a soldier. This was a warrior, briefly stopping the ceremony to deal with ignorance. "First, let's talk about your World War II story." His eyes hadn't left John's face, and there was nothing ceremonial in his posture now. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1941, fighting on land, sea, and air, while America stayed neutral for 2 years. We were the only thing standing between Hitler and total European control. John opened his mouth, but for once no words came out. The guard continued, his voice carrying the weight of historical fact, backed by military accuracy. "You mentioned the Marshall Plan. Let me remind you about what happened before it. During those 2 years of standing alone, Britain sold every foreign asset, every overseas investment, and emptied our treasury to pay for the war. We made ourselves bankrupt on purpose, giving up our empire's wealth to hold the line against fascism." The elderly veteran nodded grimly, his medals shining. The guard acknowledged him with a slight nod of his head before continuing. "When America joined the war after Pearl Harbor, and make no mistake, we welcomed your arrival with open arms. It wasn't to save us, it was to join an alliance that had already been bleeding and fighting for years. The Soviets had lost millions, the French resistance had been dying in the shadows, the Polish had been fighting since 1939. The guard's posture changed slightly, his modern military bearing becoming even clearer. "You mentioned our current military abilities. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan alongside American forces. I have trained with US Special Forces, taken part in joint NATO exercises, and earned my battle medals fighting the same enemies as your troops." His voice took on an edge of steel. "While you were watching our ceremonial duties from your tourist viewpoint, British forces were sent out in anti-terrorism operations across the world. The same soldiers you see doing ceremonial duties here have fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and secret operations you'll never hear about." Technical Sergeant Williams stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "Sir, he's right. I've worked with British SAS and RAF units. Their abilities are beyond what normal people are allowed to know." The guard cut in smoothly. "Now, about your comment regarding modern military bases." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I could tell you about RAF Fylingdales' ballistic missile warning system, or the nuclear submarine bases in Scotland, or our cyber warfare divisions. But those aren't the kind of places we show to tourists." John's confident manner had completely gone. The guard wasn't finished. "This uniform, which you so casually dismissed, represents both tradition and active service. Every guard you see here has earned their place through modern battle experience and special training. We honor our history exactly because we're still making it." He pointed to the veterans' medals. "Those decorations aren't from World War II, sir. They're from Korea, where British and American forces fought and died together, just as we did in every major battle since. The special relationship between our countries was made in shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and a common cause." The guard's voice softened slightly, though his bearing remained very sharp. "We're not a theme park, sir. We're one of America's closest military allies, with nuclear weapons, a permanent UN Security Council seat, and special forces that work so closely with yours that the enemies of freedom can't tell us apart." The morning sun caught his brass buttons as he finished. That's the reality of British military power. Not a thing of the past, but a key part of the modern Western alliance. Now, Would you like to learn about the actual history of this tower, or shall we continue discussing current military capabilities? The silence that followed the guard's words hung heavy in the morning air. John stood still, his earlier business confidence taken away by the accuracy of military fact. The woman from Manchester had gone back into the crowd, her earlier nodding approval replaced by quiet discomfort. The elderly veteran stepped forward, his posture matching the guard's military precision. "If I may add, sir," he addressed John with formal politeness that somehow cut deeper than anger. "I served in the Falklands alongside American intelligence units. My colleague here," he pointed to his companion, "was part of the first Gulf War group. While you were making opinions about our military from tourist photos, we were building the modern framework of international defense cooperation." Technical Sergeant Williams moved to stand beside the veteran. Our commanding officer in my last job was Royal Marines. He led a joint task force that included US, British, and NATO forces, sir." She addressed John directly. "The abilities of British Special Forces are considered equal to anything we have." Mary touched her husband's arm, but this time not to stop him. "John," she said quietly, "my granddad served in the RAF during those 2 years the guard mentioned, before America entered the war. That's why." She paused. "That's why I was hoping this trip would help you understand." Sarah, who had been silent throughout the guard's response, finally spoke up. "Dad, in history class, we learned about the Ultra program, how British codebreakers cracked the Nazi codes. They shared everything with American forces when they joined the war. We wouldn't have won without each other." The guard remained in his authoritative stance, but his voice carried a tone of professional respect as he addressed the gathering crowd. "The strength of our alliance isn't in comparing victories, but in understanding how they were achieved together. Your Pentagon and our Ministry of Defense share operational capabilities that I'm not allowed to talk about, but I can tell you this. When American and British forces go out together, our enemies don't see two separate nations. They see the combined strength of Western military power." John's hand moved without thinking to straighten his tie, a business habit that now seemed strangely out of place. "I seem to have spoken without knowing enough," he said, his business words failing to fully hide his genuine realization. The guard's parade ground posture returned, his bearing shifting seamlessly back to ceremonial duty. But there was a different atmosphere in the courtyard now, one of restored dignity and mutual respect. The morning sun had fully cleared the tower walls, casting long shadows across the old stones that had witnessed centuries of shared history. The woman from Manchester had already left quietly, disappearing into the crowd. A yeoman warder approached, his traditional uniform carrying new weight after the morning's history lesson. "Perhaps, sir," he addressed John with professional politeness, "you'd be interested in learning about the tower's role in modern military ceremonies. Many of your own military traditions come from these grounds." John straightened, adopting the posture of a man who had learned to reassess his position. "I believe," he said, glancing at his family, "we would all benefit from that." His voice carried the humility of the businessman who had encountered information that completely changed his analysis. Sarah stepped closer to the guard, her earlier embarrassment replaced by genuine curiosity. "Is it true that the tower still has active military command places?" "That information," the guard replied, with the faintest hint of a professional smile, "is still secret." The elderly veterans nodded in approval before leaving, their bearing matching the guard's military precision. Technical Sergeant Williams exchanged a respectful nod with the guard, the subtle acknowledgement between professional soldiers needing no words. As the Miller family followed the yeoman warder to begin their proper tour, the guard resumed his watch. The Tower of London stood as it had for centuries, its stones bearing witness to yet another lesson in the lasting alliance between two great nations, an alliance made not in competition, but in shared sacrifice and mutual respect. What do you think about this meeting between the American tourist and the Royal Guard? More importantly, what other mistaken ideas about these elite soldiers need to be cleared up? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more stories that remind us why alliances are important. See you in the next one.